Beloved, transformation does not begin in your circumstances. It begins in your mind. Many people are asking God to change their situation, while God is saying, let me change the way you think, because the life you live is always the result of the thoughts you allow. The battlefield of your life is not your job, your family, or your finances. The battlefield is your mind, and whoever controls your thinking controls your direction. Scripture tells us that as a person thinks in their heart, so are they. That means wrong thinking produces wrong living. But when God transforms your thoughts, he transforms your walk, your talk, and your destiny. When God steps into your mind, he begins to evict old mindsets, fear, defeat, bitterness, pride, and replaces them with truth, faith, and purpose. He doesn't just give you positive thoughts, he gives you divine perspective. Some of us are stuck not because God has stopped moving, but because our thinking is still tied to our past. But when God transforms your thoughts, your past no longer defines you. His promises do. Renewed thinking leads to renewed living. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding spiritually. You stop seeing obstacles and start seeing opportunities. You stop asking, why me? And start declaring, use me. And when your thoughts align with God's word, your life begins to align with God's will. Peace replaces confusion. Faith replaces fear. Hope replaces despair. Because a transformed mind produces a transformed life. So don't just ask God to bless what you're doing. Ask him to change how you're thinking. Because when God transforms your thoughts, everything connected to you begins to change. Transformation does not begin on the outside of a person's life. It begins on the inside. Many people spend years asking for a change in their environment, believing that if their circumstances shift, their lives will finally improve. But lasting change never starts with what surrounds you. It starts with what shapes you. And what shapes you is the way you think. We often confuse movement with transformation. A new job, a new location, a new relationship, or a new season may create motion. But motion does not guarantee growth. Without a renewed way of thinking, the same patterns repeat themselves in different settings. You can leave one situation and enter another, yet carry the same mindset that produced the problem in the first place. That is why true transformation cannot be dependent on external change alone. God's strategy for change is always internal before it is external. He addresses the root before he touches the fruit. Circumstances are the fruit. Thinking is the root. If the root remains unchanged, the fruit will always return in some form. That is why God focuses so much attention on the heart and the mind, because those are the control centers of a person's life. Many people want God to fix what they are facing, while God wants to fix how they are thinking about what they are facing. You may be praying for deliverance from pressure, but God may be using that pressure to expose a perspective that needs to change. When your thinking shifts, what once felt unbearable becomes manageable, and what once felt impossible becomes an opportunity for growth. The mind acts like a lens through which life is interpreted. Two people can face the same challenge, yet respond in completely different ways, not because the challenge is different, but because the thinking behind it is different. One sees defeat, the other sees development. One sees punishment, the other sees preparation. The difference is not the situation, but the mindset. That is why God does not merely offer relief, he offers renewal. Relief removes pain for a moment, but renewal reshapes perception for a lifetime. A renewed mind does not deny reality, but it views reality through truth rather than fear. It understands that God's purpose is bigger than present discomfort, and that growth often requires discomfort to accomplish transformation. When thinking remains unchanged, even blessings can become burdens. Promotion without renewed thinking can lead to pride. Provision without renewed thinking can lead to dependency. Freedom without renewed thinking can lead right back into bondage. That is why God often delays what we want until our thinking can sustain what he wants to give. Transformation in the mind also redefines identity. Many people see themselves through the lens of their failures, their upbringing, or their past mistakes. But when God transforms thinking, identity is no longer rooted in history, but in calling. You stop asking who you used to be and start discovering who you are becoming. This shift changes how you speak, how you decide, and how you respond to adversity. A transformed mind does not wait for perfect conditions to obey. It understands that obedience often comes before clarity. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Renewed thinking asks, what is God producing in me? That question alone changes frustration into faith and confusion into expectation. God's work in the mind is not instant, but it is intentional. It is a process that requires exposure to truth, submission to correction, and the willingness to let go of familiar but limiting ways of thinking. Old mindsets feel safe because they are known, but safety is not the same as growth. Transformation requires trust. Trust that God's way of thinking leads to a better way of living. When the mind is renewed, reactions change. You stop being controlled by emotions and start being guided by conviction. You stop making decisions out of fear and start making decisions out of faith. And over time, the outward life begins to reflect the inward transformation. This is why God does not start by changing your surroundings. He starts by changing your thinking. Because once the mind is transformed, the person is equipped to handle any environment. Circumstances may shift slowly or suddenly, but a transformed mind remains steady. And that is the foundation of lasting change. Every battle in life shows up somewhere visible, but it is always decided somewhere invisible. Long before a struggle appears in behavior, relationships, or circumstances, it has already taken place in the mind. The enemy understands this, which is why attacks are rarely aimed first at actions. They are aimed at thoughts. Control the thinking, and you influence the direction of the life. The mind is where choices are formed, perspectives are shaped, and beliefs are reinforced. What dominates your thoughts eventually directs your steps. That is why the greatest conflicts are not external opposition, but internal negotiations. The real question is not what is happening around you, but what is happening within you as you interpret what is happening around you. Many people are fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong place. They are frustrated with people, pressured by problems, and overwhelmed by situations. Yet the real fight is how those realities are being processed mentally. Two people can experience the same offense. One becomes bitter, the other becomes better. The difference is not the offense, but the mental battlefield where meaning is assigned. The mind is constantly under influence. Every voice you listen to, every image you entertain, and every thought you rehearse is shaping the outcome of this battle. Thoughts are not neutral, they are directional. They are either pulling you toward faith and obedience or toward fear and compromise. What you allow to stay in your mind will eventually show up in your life. That is why unchecked thoughts are so dangerous. A thought entertained becomes a belief repeated becomes a conviction, and a conviction acted upon becomes a lifestyle. No one wakes up one day and suddenly falls into spiritual defeat. It begins with small, unchallenged thoughts that were allowed to grow without accountability. The battlefield is subtle, but the consequences are significant. The mind also determines how we respond to pressure. Pressure does not create character, it reveals it. When stress enters, the mind defaults to its strongest influence. If fear dominates the mind, pressure produces panic. If truth dominates the mind, pressure produces perseverance. The battlefield becomes most visible in moments of stress because those moments expose what has been governing the thinking all along. Spiritual warfare is often misunderstood as something dramatic and external, but its primary location is internal. It is the daily contest between truth and deception, trust and doubt, submission and self-reliance. Every decision is preceded by a thought, and every thought carries a voice. Learning to discern which voices align with truth is essential to winning this battle. The mind must be guarded because it is constantly being targeted. Discouragement, distraction, pride, and fear all begin as suggestions. They do not demand immediate agreement. They seek permission to stay. Once they are accepted, they begin to influence attitude and behavior. Victory is not found in eliminating all negative thoughts, but in refusing to let them take residence. This battlefield also affects how people view God. Wrong thinking can distort the character of God, causing people to see him as distant, unfair, or uninterested. When the mind accepts these distortions, trust erodes and faith weakens. But when thinking is aligned with truth, confidence in God's presence and purpose grows, even in uncertain circumstances. The mind determines whether a person lives reactively or intentionally. Reactive thinking allows emotions and circumstances to dictate responses. Intentional thinking submits reactions to truth before action. One leads to instability, the other leads to consistency. The difference is not willpower, but mental discipline. Winning the battle of the mind does not mean suppressing thoughts, but evaluating them. Every thought must be measured against truth. If it contradicts truth, it must be rejected. If it aligns with truth, it must be embraced. This practice does not happen automatically. It requires awareness and practice. But over time, it reshapes how life is experienced. Because the mind is the battlefield, victory in life is never accidental. It is the result of daily choices about what is allowed to influence thinking. When the mind is disciplined, the life becomes directed. And when the life is directed by truth, even the fiercest battles lose their power to control the outcome. Every action a person takes is first approved in the mind. Before behavior becomes visible, a thought has already been accepted as valid. That is why the quality of a person's life can often be traced back to the quality of their thinking. When thinking is flawed, living becomes distorted, even when intentions are good. Wrong thinking does not always appear dangerous at first. It often sounds reasonable, logical, and even justified. It tells you that fear is wisdom, that bitterness is protection, that compromise is survival. But when thinking is disconnected from truth, it quietly leads life in the wrong direction. Choices begin to drift, values begin to weaken, and standards begin to adjust, not suddenly, but gradually. Many struggles that appear behavioral are actually mental. Anger often begins as unresolved thoughts of offense. Anxiety grows from repeated thoughts of loss of control. Disobedience often starts as a thought that says, "This doesn't really matter." When these thoughts are left unchallenged, they begin to shape habits, and habits eventually shape character. Wrong thinking also distorts perception. It causes people to misinterpret situations and assign meaning that may not be accurate. Correction feels like rejection. Delay feels like denial. Silence feels like abandonment. The situation itself may be neutral, but wrong thinking colors it negatively, leading to emotional reactions that are out of proportion to reality. When thinking is wrong, decision-making becomes compromised. People begin to choose what feels good over what is right, what is easy over what is necessary, what is immediate over what is eternal. These decisions may bring short-term relief, but they often produce long-term regret. The path may seem harmless at first, but it slowly leads away from purpose. Wrong thinking also influences relationships. Assumptions replace communication. Suspicion replaces trust. Self-protection replaces vulnerability. People begin reacting to what they think others mean rather than what is actually said. Over time, this creates distance, conflict, and isolation, not because relationships were destined to fail, but because thinking was never corrected. One of the most damaging effects of wrong thinking is how it shapes identity. People begin to believe lies about who they are and what they are capable of. Failure becomes a label instead of an event. Weakness becomes a definition instead of an area for growth. When identity is built on distorted thinking, confidence erodes and purpose feels out of reach. Wrong thinking also resists accountability. It justifies behavior instead of correcting it. It shifts blame instead. If truth living begins to reflect purpose, stability, and intentionality, one decision at a time, every person carries patterns of thinking that were formed long before they were aware of them. Experiences, environment, culture, wounds, and victories all contribute to mental frameworks that feel natural and familiar. Some of these frameworks are helpful, but many of them are limiting. They quietly define what a person believes is possible, acceptable, or inevitable. Transformation requires more than inspiration. It requires replacement. Old mindsets are not removed by willpower alone. They must be confronted by truth and intentionally exchanged for something greater. God does not simply ask people to stop thinking a certain way. He offers a better way to think. This exchange is essential because a mind cannot remain empty. If old patterns are not replaced, they will eventually return, often stronger than before. Fear is one of the most common mindsets that must be replaced. It convinces people to play small, avoid risk, and settle for less than they were designed for. Fear disguises itself as caution, but its true goal is control. When fear governs thinking, obedience feels dangerous and trust feels unreasonable. Replacing fear with faith does not mean the absence of concern. It means confidence in God's presence and power despite uncertainty. Another mindset that requires replacement is doubt. Doubt questions God's ability, timing, or intentions. It magnifies limitations while minimizing promises. Doubt does not always sound rebellious. Sometimes it sounds logical. But logic without faith creates ceilings where God intended growth. When doubt is replaced with trust, perspective shifts from what if it doesn't work to what if God is faithful? Defeat is also a mindset that must be evicted. Defeat convinces people that past failures determine future outcomes. It turns setbacks into sentences and mistakes into identities. When defeat dominates thinking, effort feels pointless and hope feels unrealistic. But when God replaces defeat with purpose, failure becomes instruction rather than condemnation, and persistence becomes possible again. Bitterness is another mindset that quietly poisons thinking. It holds onto offense and replays pain as a form of self-protection. But bitterness does not guard the heart, it hardens it. It distorts perception and affects decisions, often leading people to punish themselves while trying to remember the wrongs of others. Replacing bitterness with forgiveness is not denying hurt. It is releasing control of the past so healing can begin. Pride can also be an old mindset that limits growth. Pride resists correction and avoids dependence. It values appearance over authenticity and control over surrender. While pride may look like strength, it often masks insecurity. When pride is replaced with humility, learning becomes possible and connection deepens. Humility does not weaken a person. It positions them to receive what they cannot produce on their own. God's method of replacement is not condemnation, but instruction. Truth exposes what is false without shaming the person who believed it. It invites growth rather than demanding perfection. This process requires intentionality, choosing to submit thoughts to truth rather than emotion or habit. It also requires patience because replacement happens over time, not overnight. As old mindsets are replaced, new responses begin to form. Our actions that were once automatic become intentional. Emotional triggers lose their power. Decisions become more consistent. Life begins to reflect stability rather than chaos. This does not mean struggles disappear, but they no longer dominate thinking. Replacement also reshapes identity. People stop defining themselves by what they survived and start understanding themselves by why they were created. Calling becomes clearer, confidence becomes grounded, and purpose becomes motivating rather than intimidating. When thinking changes, self-perception changes, and behavior follows, this process is ongoing. Even renewed minds require maintenance. New levels bring new challenges, and growth demands continued alignment with truth. But each replacement strengthens the foundation. Old mindsets lose influence, and new patterns of thinking gain authority. When God replaces old mindsets with truth, life is no longer driven by reaction, but by intention. Thoughts begin to reflect purpose, faith, and clarity. And from that renewed thinking, a life of direction and impact begins to emerge. A renewed mind does more than make a person feel better. It fundamentally changes the trajectory of life. When thoughts are aligned with truth, actions follow naturally, relationships improve, decisions become clearer, and purpose becomes attainable. The connection between thinking and living is not incidental, it is causal. What occupies the mind inevitably shapes the life that is lived. That is why renewing the mind is not a minor adjustment, but a transformational process that affects every aspect of existence. When the mind is renewed, perspective shifts. Challenges are no longer obstacles to defeat, but opportunities for growth. Situations that once caused panic now invite faith-based solutions. Delay is no longer despair, but preparation. Loss does not destroy hope, but cultivates resilience. A renewed mind sees life through God's lens rather than personal limitation. It interprets circumstances not as ends, but as means through which character and destiny are revealed. Renewed thinking also changes priorities. When thoughts are anchored in truth, the trivial and temporary lose their power over attention. Material concerns no longer dictate decisions. Spiritual principles become the compass. Instead of chasing approval, people pursue purpose. Instead of reacting impulsively, people respond intentionally. Instead of being driven by fear or comfort, people are guided by vision and obedience. This recalibration of priorities fundamentally redirects energy toward what truly matters, producing results that are lasting rather than fleeting. Decisions become sharper and more confident when the mind is renewed. Indecision often arises from confusion, fear, or misinformation, but clarity of thought produces clarity of action. When the mind is filled with truth, the ability to discern between right and wrong, between temporary solutions and eternal outcomes is strengthened. Decisions are no longer mere reactions to circumstance, but deliberate choices informed by wisdom, faith, and principle. This kind of decision-making aligns with purpose and avoids unnecessary setbacks caused by impulsive or fear-driven choices. Relationships are also impacted by a renewed mind. Old patterns of miscommunication, suspicion, and offense often originate from distorted thinking. When the mind is transformed, perception shifts from assumption to understanding, from judgment to empathy. People stop projecting past hurts onto present situations and begin responding with clarity and wisdom. Forgiveness becomes possible. Patience becomes natural, and collaboration becomes more productive. The quality of thinking directly influences the quality of interaction with others. A mind that operates on truth fosters life-giving relationships. Emotions are profoundly affected by renewed thinking. Many people allow circumstances to dictate feelings, but a mind aligned with truth stabilizes emotional responses. Fear gives way to faith, anxiety to trust, anger to understanding, and discouragement to hope. Emotional stability does not mean the absence of trials or pain, but the presence of perspective. A transformed mind maintains balance in the storm, guiding emotional reactions toward constructive and purposeful outcomes rather than destructive ones. A renewed mind produces resilience. Life is filled with seasons of challenge, loss, and disappointment. Without renewal, these experiences can erode hope and distort identity. But when the mind is transformed, adversity becomes a tool for growth rather than a source of defeat. Resilience is cultivated because thought patterns have shifted from victimhood to stewardship, from despair to expectation. Renewed thinking equips a person to endure trials without losing faith, to persevere without surrendering to discouragement. Identity is clarified when the mind is renewed. Many people define themselves by past mistakes, failures, or the limitations imposed by others. Renewal changes the story. A renewed mind anchors identity Thank you in purpose and calling rather than circumstances. People begin to see themselves as capable, valuable, and equipped to fulfill the destiny set before them. Self-perception and confidence are strengthened, enabling actions that are consistent with potential rather than dictated by fear or self-doubt. Spiritual growth is accelerated through mental renewal. Obedience, faith, and devotion are cultivated when the mind is aligned with truth. Practices that once felt routine or hollow become meaningful expressions of trust and alignment. Scripture, prayer, and reflection are no longer obligations, but lifelines that reinforce renewed thought patterns. As thinking changes, spiritual habits deepen and produce visible transformation in character, behavior, and influence. Finally, renewed thinking produces long-term impact. Life is no longer reactive or haphazard, but intentional and purpose-driven. Decisions, behaviors, and relationships begin to reflect stability, wisdom, and vision. The influence of a person with a renewed mind extends beyond personal benefit to affect family, community, and even future generations. The transformation is contagious because it shapes not only the individual, but also the environment in which that person operates. A renewed mind shapes a renewed life. It aligns perspective with reality, priorities with purpose, emotions with truth, and identity with destiny. It equips a person to navigate challenges, engage opportunities, and live intentionally. When thoughts are transformed, everything connected to them, decisions, relationships, actions, and outcomes, follows. The outward life becomes a natural reflection of the inward renewal, producing a life that is balanced, effective, and aligned with divine purpose. When God transforms the mind, the effect is not limited to private thoughts or inner peace. It flows outward and reshapes every area of life. The transformation of thinking is the catalyst for transformation in behavior, relationships, decision-making, work, ministry, and personal influence. The mind acts as the control center of life. What occupies it dictates action, and what dictates action determines outcomes. Therefore, a mind renewed by divine truth inevitably produces a life that reflects God's purposes. This principle cannot be overstated. Inner transformation precedes outer transformation, and without one, the other is incomplete. A transformed mind changes the way a person responds to challenges. Trials that once caused despair are now opportunities for growth and discernment. Pressure is no longer a trigger for panic, but a platform for faith. Where fear once dominated, courage begins to emerge. Where confusion once clouded decisions, clarity and wisdom now guide actions. The transformation is practical, not abstract. It affects daily routines, work ethics, interactions with others, and the way responsibilities are approached. Life becomes intentional rather than reactive, and actions begin to align with purpose. Relationships also experience a significant shift when the mind is transformed. Old patterns of offense, judgment, and mistrust begin to dissolve. People no longer react impulsively to perceived slights, but choose responses grounded in understanding and grace. Communication improves because perception is clarified. Conflict is navigated with patience rather than pride. And empathy replaces outcomes determine destiny. God's work in the mind produces ripple effects that touch every aspect of existence: emotional, relational, vocational, spiritual, and social. When thinking is renewed, life becomes aligned with purpose, effective in action, and impactful in influence. Transformation begins inside and inevitably manifests outside, proving that a changed mind is the starting point for a changed life. A renewed mind does not stop at understanding truth. It equips a person to act with purpose. Transformation in thought produces transformation in action. Every decision, every habit, and every step begins in the mind. The clarity, wisdom, and discernment that emerge from a transformed mind-guide behavior toward outcomes that are intentional rather than accidental. This is why some people work tirelessly, yet see little fruit, while others, guided by renewed thinking, accomplish more in a day than many do in a lifetime. The difference is not effort, but alignment between thought and action. Purposeful action flows from a mind that has been trained to distinguish between what is fleeting and what is eternal. A mind renewed by God begins to prioritize consistently. It recognizes that time, energy, and resources are finite, and every choice should honor purpose and calling. This clarity eliminates wasted effort, misdirected focus, and distraction. People with renewed minds know that small, deliberate actions in alignment with truth can produce outcomes far beyond what mere busyness can achieve. A renewed mind also strengthens discipline. When thoughts are aligned with principles and values, actions are easier to sustain over time. Discipline becomes a natural byproduct of clarity. Habits are formed not through force, but through the consistent application of purpose-driven thinking. Where a mind is confused, inconsistent behavior follows. But where a mind is renewed, consistency is built into the framework of thought itself. Action flows naturally from belief, and consistency becomes the bridge between vision and results. Intentionality in action also comes from discernment. A transformed mind is not easily swayed by fleeting emotions, peer pressure, or unexamined trends. Decisions are evaluated against principles of truth, long-term outcomes, and alignment with purpose. This discernment protects people from making impulsive choices that could derail their progress. It also enables them to recognize and seize opportunities that others overlook because their thinking is clouded by fear, confusion, or short-sightedness. The influence of a renewed mind extends to leadership and mentorship. People whose actions are guided by renewed thinking naturally inspire, guide, and elevate those around them. Leadership is not only about authority, it is about influence, modeling integrity, and producing outcomes that benefit the greater good. A renewed mind equips individuals to act decisively, communicate clearly, and respond with wisdom, creating environments where others are encouraged to rise and fulfill their potential. Purposeful action, therefore, is not limited to personal success. It ripples outward, multiplying impact across communities, families, and organizations. Even in moments of uncertainty or challenge, a renewed mind produces action that is grounded rather than reactive. When trials arise, people with transformed thinking do not wait passively for circumstances to change. They engage with faith, strategy, and initiative, understanding that action rooted in truth can shift outcomes and create possibilities that fear would have prevented. Action guided by renewed thought bridges the gap between hope and achievement, between vision and realization. Financial stewardship and resource management are also influenced by a renewed mind. Decisions about money, investments, and giving are no longer dictated by impulsive desires or short-term satisfaction. Instead, they are informed by principles of responsibility, generosity, and long-term vision. Purposeful action in this area produces security, multiplies opportunities for influence, and creates resources that can be leveraged for personal growth, family stability, and community impact. Furthermore, a renewed mind empowers service and contribution. When thinking is aligned with purpose, individuals naturally seek ways to make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. Acts of kindness, mentorship, volunteering, and advocacy are no longer random or sporadic, but intentional expressions of values and faith. These actions produce lasting impact because they are not reactive gestures. They are deliberate, consistent, and aligned with a vision greater than oneself. A renewed mind also influences personal growth and learning. Action becomes purposeful because the individual recognizes the importance of acquiring knowledge, developing skills, and cultivating character.
Effort is not
wasted on what is irrelevant or temporary. Instead, time is invested in growth that will yield exponential returns in life, work, and relationships. Purposeful action is rooted in an understanding that what is cultivated today will shape tomorrow's opportunities and successes. Ultimately, a renewed mind ensures that life is not lived aimlessly. Every action becomes intentional, every step guided, and every effort aligned with purpose. The transformation of thought empowers a person to move forward with confidence, clarity, and consistency, producing results that are meaningful, lasting, and impactful. When thinking is renewed, action is no longer reactionary, and influence is no longer accidental. A mind transformed by truth produces a life that is deliberately impactful, leaving behind a legacy that reflects the power of God's work within